Tonight, I'm sharing 4 stories that will make you question what's waiting just beyond the tree line. The first story involves a fisherman, a quiet stretch of the Atchafalaya, and a signal light that shouldn't have existed. And by the end, you'll understand why he never set foot on that water after sundown again. What would you do if the marsh itself began signaling you like it knew your name? Tonight's stories come from people who found out the hard way. This account comes from a man who signed his email simply as Jay, a second-generation shrimper who grew up where the water eats the land, the Atchafalaya Basin, Louisiana. He said nights on the bayou were like standing inside someone else's breath, humid, close, aware. He learned to read water the way other people read road signs: current, stain, where the grass slicks left, where the wind lays the chop down flat. Those were his alphabet. He didn't believe in much, Jay told me. Not in luck, not in hauntings, not in the stories the old men swap on porches after the mosquitoes get brave. He believed in what held weight: diesel in the tank, shrimp in the hold, and the glow of his headlamp carving a path through the fog. He believed, most of all, in lights. That night, he's precise about this. It was late September, heat still dragging, a storm edge stalled somewhere in the Gulf and sending its breath inland. The water smelled metallic, like a pocket full of coins. He launched just after sunset to run his small bateau along a familiar cut, a narrow thread between stands of bald cypress that looked skeletal in the dusk, their roots like knotted fists grasping at the dark. No moon. The sky was the color of a bruise. The frogs started in, first one voice, then 1,000, then like a conductor's cue, a sudden, cooperative silence. He noticed it then. His running light on the bow stuttered. Not out, just a pulse, a kind of slow blink. He tapped the housing. The blink steadied. He told himself it was a loose wire. He told himself a lot of things that night. Jay was heading to a spot he told me used to be his father's, a bend where the current hugged the bank and the shrimp rode the seam like it was an escalator. He could have found it with his eyes closed. He practically did on fog-heavy nights when even the GPS didn't seem to believe where he was. But halfway there, the water flattened. He felt it under the hull, like a pressure change when you're in a plane and your ears won't pop. The frogs held their breath again. He cut the throttle to idle. That's when he saw the other light. About 100 yards ahead, low to the waterline, not a boat's mast light or stern lamp, not the arrogant glare of a gator hunter's rig. This was a single cold white point, a pearl against the dark. It was not on the chart, and it was exactly where his father used to anchor. He leaned forward, hand on the tiller, trying to decide if he should call out. Lights mean people. People mean help, or trouble, or evidence that you didn't just drift into the old stories. The white point brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again, keeping rough time with the stuttering pulse of his own bowlight, like 2 beacons learning one another's rhythm. He said the first thing he did was answer. He eased the throttle. 2 pulses from his bowlight, unintentional, he thought, even as the other light responded with 2 slow blinks. A breath caught behind his breastbone. The frogs restarted and stopped again, as if shushed. He drifted closer. The cypress trunks on either side felt closer too, leaning in, hung with Spanish moss that barely stirred though a breeze lifted the sweat from his skin. He smelled something unfamiliar for that water. Old paper, like a damp book left open. A thin slick rippled across the surface, and the light ahead blinked once, deliberate, and moved. Not on a wake, not bouncing like a lantern on a boat, but gliding, just above the water, toward the bend. Logic asserted itself, as it does when you live by your ears and hands and engine noise. Some punk, he thought. Some tourist with a drone and a light, trying to spook the locals and rack up views. He felt a strained laugh work up his throat and stuck it back down. He called out finally, "Gotcha! Good one!" His voice didn't come back to him. No echo from the trees, just a dull swallowing of the sound, as if the moss were listening with its mouth open. He trimmed the motor and followed. The white point maintained its distance, like a polite guide. It led him through the bend into the old anchorage, the water turning syrup slow, and then stopped. He came up behind it, bow light and that white pearl throwing overlapping circles on the surface. Something glittered under them. He cut the motor. Without the engine, the night settled with a weight he felt in his teeth. There were tiny noises, air bubbles ticking up from the mud, the distant click of a crab's claws brushing the hull, a heron shifting a dozen yards off, and there was the steady, patient blink of the light. On the third blink in that quiet, Jay realized why the smell bothered him. It wasn't just damp paper, it was glue, the kind they used to bind charts. He'd grown up with his father's old rolled maps in a milk crate by the galley table, edges furry with use. He felt himself smile in the dark, small and reflexive, and then he stopped, because the twitch of his own facial muscles sounded loud in that hush. He looked down. The glittering in the halo wasn't bait flash. It was thin and square and pale, paper. Hundreds of pale rectangles drifting up from the depth like moths to a porch light. He hooked one with the tip of his paddle and lifted it. It was waterlogged and soft, but even in that state he could read the black lines, soundings, contours, a printed name that broke his heart open. Atchafalaya Basin, Eastern Flats, his father's favorite sheet. He wasn't sentimental, he insists. He's not the kind of man who cries over paper. But his hands trembled. His father had been gone 5 years. Those maps were buried with him, because his mom said that was fitting, and Jay agreed. Yet here they were, rising like breath. His father's handwriting on one, a note in blue pencil, "Anchor here after storm, safe seam." The white light blinked again, slow, considerate. Jay could feel the pattern now, 2 short, 1 long, repeating. His own bow light answered, though he didn't touch a thing. 2 short, 1 long. He whispered, "Stop it," to the boat, because it felt like the boat had a say in this. The papers increased, a snow of pages in a swamp, swaying just below the surface. He leaned farther over to see how deep the drift went. His stomach touched the gunwale. A page lifted like a pale hand, brushed his wrist for a second, and slid off. He couldn't tell if the cold on his skin was water or something like a tension. The frogs began again, not in a chorus, but in a staggered call that moved around him in a slow circle, as if something walked the bank and the sound stepped ahead of it like a herald. The cypress knees rose like teeth in the dark. He caught movement on the periphery, not the light, not a boat, but the sway of moss where there was no wind. He told himself a raccoon had taken an interest. He told himself a cottonmouth slid between roots. He told himself everything that would make a simple shape of what he felt. None of it stuck. He said his father used to spit over the side before he dropped anchor. "Feed the water first," he'd say. Jay had mocked the ritual until he caught himself doing it without thinking. He did it now, a quick reflex of tongue and air, and watched the spit disappear, then reappear, buoyed by the halo of the light's reflection, perfectly centered as if he'd hit an invisible mark. 2 short blinks, 1 long. He remembered, this part sat on him hard, how his father used to signal him at night when Jay was a kid and they ran 2 boats. He'd blink the handheld 2 short, once long to say, "Stay on my wake." It wasn't a code that existed in any maritime manual. It was theirs. Jay spoke then, softly, because the hush demanded it. "That you?" He didn't expect an answer. He got one anyway, just not the kind with words. The light dimmed to a coal, then swelled until it shivered on the water. The papers dipped and rose, like breath under a sheet. A soft sound reached him from under the hull. Not scraping, not fish, A tap, then another, then a pause, as if someone waited to hear if he understood. He wanted to go. He didn't. The kind of fear that keeps a man alive is practical. Get out, get clear, get back to the boat ramp, get on the highway where lights mean rules again. But there was another kind of fear, the kind that pulled him closer, because not knowing would fill him up worse than anything that could happen in the next 5 minutes. He chose the second fear. He took the anchor line in his hand. It was dry. He hadn't dropped it. He looked down at the pile of rope on the deck. It moved. No current made that pattern. The coils traveled, quietly, like a rope pulled through a closed fist. The end drew towards the bow, toward the light, inch by inch, and slid over the lip with a polite, deliberate whisper. The weight dropped without splash, as if set down on a pillow. The bow tugged forward, 1 nod, 2, and then held, perfectly in line with the light's reflection. That's when the air went cool. Not a breeze, a temperature drawn from the night like someone opened a door to a tiled room. His breath fogged. The frogs fell silent for the last time. He heard it next to his ear, paper turning, a page flipped by a careful hand. He looked down at the rectangles in the water. They were no longer random drift. They had arranged around his boat, edges touching, lines connecting, a quilt of charts that depicted this exact bend from decades ago, before the storms carved it wider, before the new cut formed, before men decided to redraw what water already knew. In the center of that makeshift map, a small circle had been penciled in. Anchor here after storm, safe seam.
Jay reached for the circle with the blade of his paddle, not quite touching. The light pulsed once, then went still, like a held breath. A hush pressed on him so hard his ears rang. He lowered the paddle until the blade kissed the mark on the paper, and at that exact touch, something at the bottom tapped the hole again. 3 times. Then again. 3 times. He recognized it. Boatman will. The knock of chain against an anchor eye when a swell rocks you gently. Except there was no swell, and he had not dropped chain. His hands acted faster than thought. He snatched the line, felt it tight as if someone held it on the bottom. He pulled. It resisted. He pulled harder. The line gave an inch, 2, then stopped. Not snagged, not fouled, held. He had the quick, shameful thought, ridiculous and human, that if he lost the anchor his father had used, he would have to explain to someone who no longer asked questions. "Let go," he whispered. To what, he couldn't say. The light dimmed, as if considering. The line slackened in his fist, came aboard a foot, 2, then snapped taut and jerked him forward so hard his chest barked on the gunwale. Reflex saved him from going over. He planted his feet and swore through clenched teeth and pulled back. The line went still. He tasted copper. The white light flickered rapidly now, pattern broken, as if laughter had a visible shape. He had a sudden, vivid memory of his father teaching him not to strong-arm a thing you didn't understand. "Ease it," his father had said, guiding Jay's hand with 2 fingers. "Talk to it like it's a mule that wants to be convinced." He eased. The line listened. It gave, inch by inch, cooperative, until he felt the anchor come up from the mud with a kiss and a sigh. It broke surface slick with silt, and, he swears this, bone white. He blinked, and it was just his old fluked hook, scummed like always. He set it on the deck, breath shaking. The light had retreated while he worked, not far, just beyond his reachable water, hovering, pulsing. 2 short, 1 long. Stay on my wake. He understood then that following wasn't the lesson, leaving was. He started the motor with fingers that didn't quite belong to him. The engine coughed, caught, and settled. The light turned and slid ahead, slow, generous. He followed it, bow light in sympathy with it. The papers broke apart, floated down like exhausted moths. The rope lay where a rope should. The frogs, brave again, found their song in pieces, and then all at once. The guide led him through the bend, past the hush-heavy cypress, back into water that felt like water again. At the mouth of the cut that led toward the ramp, the white point paused. It pulsed twice, long and slow. The space around Jay's ribs felt roomy again. He lifted a hand in a gesture that was not a wave and not a blessing and not anything he'd let another man see him do, and then the light went out. Not off, out. Like a candle pinched, the wick saved for later. On the run back, Jay found reasons. Drone boys with a trick light. Fisherman pranking the local who thinks he knows everything. A nest of gas, a reflection of his own lamp. A handful of maps torn from a forgotten crate. He lined those reasons up like decoys on a string and hung them across the night in his mind. They worked until he tied off at the ramp and stepped onto shore and heard far out in the dark water where he had just been 3 soft taps in a row. Then silence. He went home and set the anchor on the porch to dry. In the morning he swore he wouldn't look, and of course he did. On one fluke, streaked through the silt in blue pencil, water must have carried pigment and patience to find the metal. Stay on my wake. He scrubbed at it with a rag until the words were just an impression of color. The color wouldn't leave entirely. He tells me it hasn't, to this day. Jay says he doesn't fish nights anymore. He claims it's because the storms reshaped the channels and he doesn't trust his charts the way he used to, and that's true enough. But he also says the bayou is a place that remembers, and sometimes it remembers you back, more clearly than you'd like. He keeps the anchor in the shed now. He keeps a battery lantern on the kitchen table. He doesn't turn it on. He keeps it near. Sometimes when a front's blowing in and the pressure drops and the house boards creak like ships in a cradle, he swears the lantern brightens a little on its own. 2 short, 1 long. He doesn't test it. He nods once, like a pupil to a teacher at the end of a lesson, and goes to bed with his window cracked and the smell of wet paper sneaking in. If you ask him what it was, he'll tell you he has no idea. If you ask him if it felt like someone, he'll look out past you toward water you can't see from where you're standing, and he'll say, very soft, it felt like a promise about the way home. Jay hasn't returned to that bend after dark. He marked an X over it on his new charts and wrote, daylight only. He switched to morning runs and learned to love how the cypress looks like old men lifting their hats when the sun comes through fog. But on some afternoons, when stormlight turns everything pewter, he finds himself drifting, engine low, until he sees that stretch of water and feels the pressure change in his ears. He turns away every time. He says the bayou gave him an answer that night. It didn't owe him a second one. Before you go, have you ever experienced something similar? A light where there shouldn't be one, a sign that felt too personal to ignore? Share your story in the comments. Yours might be featured in a future video.
The second story involves a young couple, a midnight shortcut, and whispers in the swamp that seem to follow them. And by the end, you'll understand why they vowed never to set foot near Cypress Hollow again. What would you do if the night itself started whispering your name? This account comes from L&T, a couple who, back in 2014, thought they were just taking the faster route home. They'd been visiting family near Morgan City, and instead of sticking to the main highway, they cut through a narrow service road that wound along the edge of the cypress swamp. It was a decision, they admit, they regret to this day. It was past midnight, the kind of humid Louisiana night where the air feels sticky on your skin and the mosquitoes find you even if you've got the windows rolled up. They were in an old pickup, the headlights throwing cones of yellow across a dirt road that barely looked wide enough for one vehicle. The swamp pressed close on either side, cypress trees rising tall and skeletal, their roots twisting like hands clawing out of the water. Spanish moss drooped in curtains, moving slightly though no breeze stirred. The stillness was heavy, broken only by the chirp of frogs and the occasional splash of something unseen hitting the black water. At first, the couple laughed about it. Elle joked that it felt like a scene from a horror movie. T tapped the dashboard clock and said, "As long as we make it home before 2, nothing's going to crawl out of that swamp." They laughed, but the sound fell flat, swallowed quickly by the humid dark. It was T who noticed it first. A sound, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, except there was no wind. A whisper, low, stretched, syllables drawn out just enough to be nearly words. At first, T thought it was Elle mumbling, maybe teasing. But Elle shook their head. They turned down the radio. Nothing. Just the hum of the truck and the rasp of tires on gravel. And it came again, clearer this time. Not just sound, but direction, like it was weaving between the trees, following alongside the truck. They both froze. The whisper wasn't a voice carried from far away. It was near. Close enough that Elle swore they felt it brush against their ear despite the closed window. The words were too soft to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, coaxing, like someone calling a child to step off the porch. They tried to rationalize. Maybe a radio signal bleeding through. Maybe sound carrying strangely over the water. But then it came again, louder, layered, as if more than one voice had joined in, overlapping whispers spilling over one another like a crowd murmuring in church. T gripped the wheel tighter and pressed the gas. The old truck rattled over the uneven road, but the whispers kept pace, always near, never falling behind. Then the road narrowed even more, one tire dipping dangerously close to the swamp's edge. The headlights caught the sheen of water where the bank had eroded away. They slowed, unwilling to risk losing the road entirely. That's when the whispering changed. It said T's name. Clear, distinct. A voice so familiar that T's stomach lurched. It wasn't just a random word. It was their mother's voice. Soft, sing-song, the way she used to call them in for dinner as a child. Except their mother lived 2 hours away, fast asleep in her bed. Elle went rigid beside them, eyes wide. Because Elle heard it too. Not T's mother's voice, but their own father's. Calm, warm, the kind of voice that made you trust it. The whispers began weaving in and out, trading tones, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes young, sometimes old. The words weren't all clear, but they always seemed to mimic someone the listener loved. Come here. This way. Don't be afraid. The truck's engine stuttered. Not stalled, just hiccuped, like something tugged at it. T slammed the gas, desperate, and the tires spun gravel. But no matter how hard they pushed the engine, the whispers were always right there. Then came the laughter. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even sharp. It was quiet, like someone chuckling into their own hands. But it came from both sides of the truck at once, moving in perfect rhythm with the headlights as they swayed down the path. Elle shouted at T to stop, to turn around, to get them out. But the road was too narrow. No shoulder to swing a U-turn, only water and trees. The whispers surged again, louder now. Hundreds of voices, some high, some guttural, overlapping like a chant but never in unison.
Through the noise, certain phrases stood out. Too late. You're ours. Step out. Then, as the headlights swept the trees ahead, they both saw it. Shapes. Dozens of them, standing just beyond the tree line, tall, thin silhouettes draped with moss, their heads cocked too far to the side. They didn't move. They didn't step forward. They only leaned, waiting as if the truck itself had rolled into their circle. Every instinct screamed at T to floor it, so they did. The truck roared forward, gravel spitting, engine whining. But the whispers were always there. Louder, desperate now. Some pleading, some angry, some even mocking. The dirt road stretched longer than either of them remembered. They drove until the dashboard rattled, until sweat slicked their hands, until their throats were raw from shouting at each other to keep going, keep going, keep going. And then, suddenly, the trees broke. The road widened, and the swamp fell away. They shot out onto asphalt, headlights glaring off a reflective green sign that pointed toward the highway. The truck's engine settled back into its normal rumble. And just like that, silence. No whispers, no laughter, no figures in the trees. They pulled into a gas station 15 minutes later, both shaking too hard to speak. They sat there in the cab with the engine idling, breathing in the stale air freshener, unwilling to step outside. Finally, T got out, circled the truck with a flashlight, half expecting to see claw marks or moss or something stuck to the paint, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. Except when T leaned close to the driver's side window, their breath fogging the glass, they noticed faint streaks running diagonally across it, like finger trails, as if someone had been pressing their face close, dragging their hand down the glass, whispering into the cabin. They didn't take that shortcut again. They don't even drive that road in daylight anymore. And whenever someone jokes about getting lost in the bayou, L and T both go quiet, because they know sometimes the swamp doesn't just watch. Sometimes it calls. Before you go, what would you have done in their place? If the swamp started whispering in the voice of someone you loved, would you have stopped or kept driving? So share your answer in the comments.
The third story involves a lonely Levee road, a woman in white, and a warning no driver should ever ignore. And by the end, you'll understand why this witness refuses to travel the back roads after dark. What would you do if the road itself refused to let you pass? This account comes from a man named Charles, who worked as a delivery driver around Baton Rouge in the early 2000s. He spent most nights ferrying supplies from one warehouse to another, and because he valued speed over comfort, he often took shortcuts most drivers avoided. One of those shortcuts was an old levee road that ran alongside the Mississippi before cutting back through the bayou. It was a rough stretch. No guardrails, no lights, just asphalt laid narrow over the crown of the levee. On one side, the dark river rolled broad and patient. On the other, swamp and cypress swallowed what little light the stars gave. Charles had driven it so many times he hardly noticed anymore. But one humid July night, just past 2 a.m., he noticed. He said the night felt off, even before he turned onto the levee. The air was thick with fog rolling low from the river, and his headlights threw a short, hazy tunnel ahead. The frogs were quiet. Even the insects, usually battering his windshield in clouds, seemed absent. He turned down his radio, the silence pressing in harder than the music ever could. Half a mile in, he saw her. A woman, standing on the side of the road. She was barefoot, her dress pale and old-fashioned, hem brushing her ankles, hair hanging long and damp. She didn't wave. She didn't move. She just stood with her back to the water, staring straight at his truck as though she'd been waiting for him. Charles braked hard. His headlights washed over her, and for a moment he swore her face looked familiar, though he couldn't place why. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone from church, maybe just a trick of recognition the brain plays when it wants comfort in strangeness. He slowed to a crawl, debating whether to stop. Picking up strangers wasn't safe, but leaving someone stranded on the levee at this hour felt cruel. He edged closer, rolling the window down a crack. The smell hit first. Not rot, not mud, but river water, cold and mineral, like an old dock piling. Then she turned her head. Not fully, just enough that he caught the edge of her face in the beam. Her lips parted as though to speak, but what came out wasn't words. It was a whisper, stretched thin, like wind hissing through reeds. It didn't sound angry, but it wasn't right either. Charles stopped the truck. His instincts screamed at him not to open the door, but something in the back of his skull, something quieter and deeper, pushed him to listen. The woman lifted her hand and pointed down the levee road, toward the next curve where fog pooled thickest. She didn't move her lips again. The whisper came anyway. "Not that way."
Charles's mouth went dry. He gripped the wheel, weighing his options. Keep driving, ignore her, or listen. He rolled forward another few yards. In the rear view, her figure stayed perfectly still, pale dress unmoving, even though a breeze had begun to stir the moss. His gut twisted. Against every rational thought, he braked again, put the truck in park, and stepped out. The night swallowed him. The sound of the river pressed close, heavy and endless. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. He opened his mouth to ask if she was all right, but the words came out muffled, like speaking underwater. The woman didn't answer. She only lowered her hand and looked past him to the fog ahead. Charles turned to follow her gaze. At first he saw nothing, just the dim beam of his headlights scattering against the mist. But then, shapes. Low, crouched, moving fast across the levee road ahead. Not animals, not men, shadows that didn't match the direction of the lights. They darted in and out of view, just at the edge of the curve. His chest tightened. The woman whispered again, though her lips never moved. "Don't go." Charles stumbled back toward the cab, heart hammering. He didn't even look at her again. He climbed in, slammed the lock down, and sat frozen with his hands on the wheel. The radio fizzed with static. The headlights flickered once, twice. Then the mist ahead thinned just enough for him to see clearly. The shadows were gone. When he finally found the courage to glance out the side window, the woman was gone too. No footprints, no disturbance in the fog, just an empty stretch of road behind him. He turned the truck around, something he'd never dared do on the levee before, and retraced his route back to the main highway. His hands shook on the wheel the whole way. Later, he told his story to a fellow driver at the warehouse. The man went pale, said he'd heard the same thing from others, that a woman in white sometimes appeared on the levee road, always pointing at the next bend, always whispering a warning. And those who ignored her? The stories weren't clear. A truck found wrecked at the bottom of the levee. A driver who swore he saw headlights barreling towards him, only for nothing to be there. A man who vanished altogether. Charles doesn't know what waited past that bend, or whether it was real at all. But he never took the levee road again. And to this day, when fog rises off the Mississippi, he says he feels the weight of unseen eyes waiting for the next driver who won't listen. Charles changed his route permanently, even though it added an extra 20 minutes to his night runs. He said it wasn't fear that kept him away exactly. It was respect. Respect for whatever walks the levee after dark, whispering warnings to those willing to hear them. He keeps a crucifix on his dashboard now, not because he thinks it will save him, but because he says it helps him remind him that some roads are better left to the ones who belong there. What would you have done if you saw her? Would you have trusted the woman's warning or driven into the fog? Share your answer in the comments. The fourth story involves a hunter, a moonlit swamp, and shadows that seem to move where no human could walk. And by the end, you'll understand why he swears something lives beneath the Spanish moss that doesn't want to be seen. Some sounds you can ignore, but sometimes it's the silence that follows that tells you you're not alone. This last account comes from a man named Everett, who grew up hunting the backwaters south of Lafayette. He wasn't easily spooked. He'd spent nights knee-deep in water with gators sliding by, camped out alone with nothing but a lantern and a shotgun. The swamp was his second home. But even Everett admits the swamp changes after midnight. It was late October, cool enough that the mosquitoes were scarce, but warm enough for fog to hug the water. Everett was tracking wild hogs along a ridge that dipped into a flooded cypress hollow. He carried a lantern in one hand, rifle slung on his back, boots squelching in mud with each step. He said the moss was so thick that night it looked like curtains draped from the trees, pale gray in the moonlight. The air was dense with the smell of wet leaves and stagnant water. The only sound was the steady plop of frogs and the occasional splash of something unseen moving just beneath the surface. Everett had stopped to check tracks when he noticed it. A hush. Not silence, but a sudden layering of quiet, like the swamp had held its breath. The frogs quit. The crickets cut off. Even the water stilled. He lifted his lantern. The flame wavered. And in that moment, he saw a shadow move where no shadow should. It slid across the moss above him, long and tall, like the outline of a man, but there was nothing there to cast it. No tree branch, no figure, no trick of light. Just the sway of Spanish moss, and behind it, something darker moving in sync. Everett froze. His first thought was another hunter, someone trying to spook him, but the way it moved, stretching unnaturally, bending where moss didn't bend, chilled him deeper than any prank could. He stepped back. The shadow stopped. The moss hung still. Then came the whisper. Not a voice, not words, but a rustle that seemed to form intention. A soft brushing sound, like cloth dragged across bark, weaving syllables he couldn't quite make out. Everett gripped his rifle but didn't raise it. His lantern flickered again, and he swore the shadow's shape shifted. Elongated, jointed wrong, arms stretching too far. It crawled sideways along the moss as though gravity didn't apply. And then it looked down at him. There were no eyes, no face, just the weight of attention. He felt it in his chest, in the tiny hairs on his neck standing rigid. It was the same sensation he'd felt as a child when someone stared at him from across a room, the certainty of being watched. Everett muttered a prayer under his breath, forcing his boots to move. The mud clung, reluctant. He didn't look up again until he reached a clearing where the moss thinned and the moonlight fell full on the water. For a moment, relief. The swamp looked ordinary again. But then, ripples. Not one, dozens. Circles spreading across the still black water, though nothing had fallen in. Everett crouched, lantern trembling, trying to see. The ripples grew, overlapping, as if something large moved just beneath the surface. He backed away, slow, careful not to stumble. But the swamp betrayed him. His heel struck a root, and he hit the ground hard. The lantern tipped, light flaring wide across the water. And he saw them. Figures beneath the surface. Not fish, not gators. Human shapes. Dozens, pressed against the underside of the water as if the swamp itself were a pane of glass. Their outlines twisted, arms stretched out, mouths moving in silent cries. Their shadows clung upward, stretching through the moss above him. Everett scrambled up, nearly dropping his rifle, heart slamming so hard he thought it would burst. He ran, not with a hunter's caution, but with the raw, reckless panic of a man chased. The moss swayed as if stirred by unseen hands. The shadows followed, slipping tree to tree, bending low. He didn't stop until he reached the ridge and the dirt road beyond. There, the night returned to normal. Frogs croaked, crickets chirped. The lantern steadied. The swamp behind him looked calm, ordinary. But Everett swore he could still see faint ripples spreading across the water, as if those submerged figures were still pressing upward, waiting for someone else to step too close. Everett never hunted that hollow again. He still goes into the swamp, old habits die hard, but he avoids the moss-draped ridges after dark. He says the swamp is alive in ways most people don't understand, and some things are meant to remain beneath it. What haunts him most isn't the shadow that moved where no man stood. It's the faces he saw below the water, their mouths open as though begging him to look longer, to remember them. He tells anyone who'll listen, if the moss sways when there's no wind, don't look up. And if the water ripples when nothing's moving, don't stay. Before you go, would you have looked closer at the water or run the way Everett did? Tell me in the comments. Your answer might be featured in a future video. And if stories like these keep you coming back for more, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon. I share new horror stories every day to keep you looking over your shoulder. Until then, trust the silence, fear the shadows, and never linger beneath the Spanish moss. Sweet dreams.